Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Head Foundation and ADB to share with you something about how Singapore has approached some of the issues that has been discussed earlier. So I've focused on looking at curriculum, and in my view, curriculum encompasses as well pedagogy and assessment as well. The structure of my presentation will be in three parts. I want to provide a sort of short history, if you like, of educational development in Singapore. The idea is that Singapore faced, at certain earlier phases, some of the issues that are faced in the countries that are represented in this program. And so while it's not a case of me saying, Singapore did this and it worked and you ought to do this, it's my way of saying this is how we responded to the challenge. And I hope that some of the ideas, some of the best practices, some of the failures that we had would be something that would also inform curriculum development, assessment reform, pedagogic change, teacher capacity building, and all those things that are intrinsically involved in making an education system viable and meeting the needs of the moment for the particular country that it is. So I'm going to be looking at the Singapore system, and although I'm going to share some indicators with regard to the other countries that are represented, I want to caution that this is not because I'm saying, as I said earlier, how Singapore succeeded in some areas, but this is a measure of the ways in which we can learn from each other. We're all part of Southeast Asia. We all have certain educational goals in common. Certainly the COVID pandemic has impacted all of us. How are we responding to these challenges? What are the implications for curriculum? What are the implications for even thinking of a redesign of how we are thinking about education? So please keep in mind that the comparisons are not intended to suggest that we should be looking at Singapore exclusively. I'm suggesting that I'm looking at Singapore because I'm a Singaporean, I know the system best, and therefore I think I can say something about it. Also keep in mind that context matters, okay? Context differs, size, the history of the education system, the goals of the education system are some of the things that are similar in some ways, but different in other ways. So again, I caution that I don't want to be misunderstood that I'm talking about Singapore with a view that it holds lessons for everybody else. I think we ourselves are continuing to learn, continuing to respond to the new curriculum and pedagogy challenges. And as a person who's been in education for almost 50 years, I think there are issues that we have not quite resolved, and I will address some of this later on. So basically, I've put together some indicators with regard to the countries that are in this program. We'd hope that Sri Lanka would join us, but unfortunately, they've not been able to do so. I won't spend much time on the country comparisons. You're all experts, whether you're from the Philippines or Nepal or Bhutan. I can say about Singapore something. One, a small country, small population. We're only about 5.6 million people. But it is a country that has been able, given that we had no natural resources, given that we had to come up in 1965 with a nation building program, if you like. And the nation building program to a very large extent was centered on education. Because if you don't have natural resources, then one should ask, what else can you rely on? We can rely on the population. And what would the population need? How would it need to build capacity? The quality of education, the type of education, the curriculum, the quality of the teachers, the infrastructure. These are all the things that would be fundamental in understanding the transformation that Singapore has made. So today, for example, the GDP per capita in Singapore, let me just look at this and give you a figure. In 1965, it was US $516. In 2020, it was 60,000 US dollars. That's the transformation in about 50 plus years of the Singapore economy. And while I wouldn't say everything was due to the quality of education, to the types of education that we provided, to the goals that we have for education, it was certainly a major, major contributor to the transformation that we had in Singapore. The type of education, because it's a small island, our system is largely a public system, meaning that all students who are enrolled in elementary, high school, senior high school, universities tend to be Singaporeans. Certainly from K to 12, no child of a Singapore citizen can enroll and can be enrolled in a private school without the express permission of the Ministry of Education. That's what I mean by it's a national system of education. The private sector is very small, but the private sector largely caters to the children of non-citizens, of expatriate persons. So I think that's something to be considered. We don't have regions as such. We have one Ministry of Education that oversees the education system, the public education system for the whole of Singapore. And perhaps one exception that we might have, which is different from other countries, although we are a bilingual system of education, the major language of instruction in all Singapore schools is English. And so we probably are one of the few countries, if the only country, that has that language, a language that is not native to the population, as a major medium of instruction. And perhaps later on, when the opportunity provides, we can be discussing why this might be so. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the recent education policy reforms. Singapore, one of the ways in which Singapore thinks that it can meet the challenges of the present and the future is to continually strive to improve, to identify issues, to identify problems that need addressing. And so I think one of the things about Singapore is that although we are talking about 1997, it is not the case, for example, that was when the major education reform began. Given my own history in the Singapore education system, 1978, for example, when the underperformance of the education system, the attrition were major issues, and what we did at that point in time to reform the education system. So there's been a continual building up since 1965 in addressing issues promptly, bringing resources to it, and then seeing how well that reform is playing out. So I'm moving forward because I think that 1997 and 2005, Thinking Schools, Learning Nation, Teach Less, Learn More, are, in my view, very seminal reports because they didn't touch upon the content of the curriculum, but they touched very much on the pedagogy, because the concern at that point in time was mastery of content, doing well in exams was not going to prepare the future workforce, the future citizens that Singapore was to require. So if we are moving into post-industrialization, a knowledge economy, what sort of curriculum, what sort of pedagogy, what sort of assessment would be appropriate? And so what we were doing with looking at these two reforms was basically to think in terms of what students would require to learn. Not required, how they would learn. In other words, learning to learn. What might that mean if we unpack that slogan, learning to learn? What might need to change in terms of pedagogy? What might need to change in terms of day-to-day practices that teachers have practices that are basically largely routinized because they were going to get through a fairly heavy content curriculum. So while we talked about reducing the content of the curriculum, we also addressed the issues of how students should be taught, how much autonomy we should provide to students, how they might apply what they have learned, and so make learning much more active, much more meaningful, much more individualized, if you like. And a third aspect of that would be that we would also be looking at assessment. Assessment, as I will discuss later, was really the hardest nut to crack. And I'm not quite sure that we have cracked it yet. But I'll make this point now, that if you do not reform the assessment structures that you have, and you try and change, reduce content, or try and change pedagogy, it's most likely that the pedagogic changes that you want, the new learning modalities that you want, are not going to work out, because they will continue to be held back by the type of assessment that you have. That's certainly been our experience. So I'll talk a little bit later about how we are trying to do assessment reform. I also want to point out, and I see that quite a lot of the countries have been dealing with issues of IT, and it's understandable. We are moving into a technological future, a digital future. Singapore started thinking about the IT master plans that we needed in 1997. So we started earlier than most other countries in the region, which is not to say, therefore, that we were well prepared when the pandemic struck and we had to move into online learning and digital learning and blended learning, that everything worked well. So again, you can be prepared, but you have to be alert. You have to be very close to the ground. For example, we sort of assumed we had a master plan, but we assumed, therefore, that every family in Singapore would have access to broadband, would have internet access, the students would have their handphones, the families would have their tablets. This is not the case, because even in an affluent society like Singapore, there are socioeconomic differences, all right? And the children are impacted by the level of resource that is available in the home. So the ministry can mandate certain hours in which will be home-based learning with the expectation that children will be able to have the technology tools to be able to access that. It turned out to be the case. And the ministry had to step in to provide some of these digital devices that children and households will require in order to be able to do home-based learning. We will come back to this later. Go on. Okay, so I want to be able to touch a little bit on curriculum, because this was propping up, is in my title, so I should be speaking about it. First, every educator will agree that curriculum must respond to educational, economics, social changes, and opportunities. It cannot afford to be only static or stable, all right? But it needs to be both stable and flexible, because you can't keep changing the curriculum every 10 years, because this will be disruptive to students who are going through the whole system. So there must be a certain degree of stability. Nobody would argue, for example, that STEM subjects should not be part of the curriculum or be changes, or language learning, right? So stability in the curriculum is important for the system to be able to develop the curriculum, to develop the education system and the pedagogy and the learning that students will aspire to in a predictable manner. But it cannot be static. It needs to be flexible. And I think what we are seeing in many countries because of the COVID phenomenon and the technological changes that we are seeing is a degree of flexibility. But it's easy to agree that we need to change. The question would be, what do we change? What do we keep? How much do we change? Even cutting back on a congested curriculum is a good idea, but what do you cut? How do you cut it? And what happens to the teachers who are teaching a particular content? Or when you add new things on, are you also taking out old things? So there's a number of issues around, but broadly speaking, stability and flexibility are important. Curriculum must be appropriate to student level and ability. Yes, that is very important. And one assumes that curriculum developers know this and appreciate this. But even in Singapore, for example, when we had introduced streaming, for example, we had issues that we clustered students as good learners or not so good learners into 3 tracks, express and extended programs and such like that. You will remember from your school days that classes in a particular level would be graded from A, B, C, E. The idea being that students in the A class would be the good learners, capable learners. Students in D and E would not be. But would that be the best way of grouping students who have different abilities, different levels of achievement? Few systems, to my knowledge, would look at an E class and say, hey, this is a weak class, but there might be individuals in the weak class who are good in a particular subject area. They might be good in history or they might be good in maths, but doing poorly in science or in geography or in language. So how do you at a curriculum level, at a classroom organization level, ensure that the appropriate curriculum, the appropriate pedagogy, the appropriate assessments meet the needs of a particular learner, rather than classify them in a bureaucratic sort of way? They sat for this exam, this is the level of ability that they had, and we chopped them up into classroom. Curriculum change, which is happening all over the region, must be accompanied by teacher capacity building. What would that mean? Is it the same old type of PD that we have? Do we need to empower teachers more actively so that they will take charge? They will have some input into the type of learning that they want. If you introduce new subjects in the curriculum, has there been adequate preparation for teachers to be able to teach the new content? Are the assessments, if you, for example, say that pedagogy must be active, must be learner-centered, what would assessments look like in a learner-centered learning environment for students as opposed to something that is dictated elsewhere? Textbooks for a new curriculum. Sometimes these lag times mean that a curriculum is announced by the ministry, but the resources that are needed at the textbook level, at the teacher capacity level, are not there. And finally, and I come back to this again, because the Singapore experience, in my view, has to some extent had to do with what type of an assessment regime we have. And one of the statements that I think is very useful to bear in mind, a tight coupling between high-stakes examinations and instruction limits pedagogic innovation. So, broadly speaking, and this is a book that the former Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister of Singapore published. It's an account of his government's thinking about, acting upon, and the transformation that they were able to bring. And you will see that it is Singapore from 1965 to Singapore 2000. And I touched earlier on what role education played in Singapore's societal development and what challenges await education in the post-development stage. What were our key challenges? Our key challenges were to build social cohesion in an ex-colony divided by race, language, culture, and religion. I think all societies, all nations in Southeast Asia have a degree of diversity. No country is completely of one ethnic group or has one language. If it is a large country like the Philippines or Indonesia, the regions will display a distinct identity, whether this is in a particular language they use or a particular type of economic activity they have. But I would argue that Singapore is an example of extreme diversity. In a small island, we have groups that are distinct and different in terms of racial identity, language, culture, and religion. And so the educational challenge to try and cope with this level of diversity means that education must both reflect, but it also must respond and rise above these differences so that social cohesion, a national identity can be created. And so we'll talk about some of the education programs that have been developed. Secondly, we needed to change. So some of those things I talked about earlier about a curriculum that is stable, language of the instruction. So we will need to move on and to build a robust economy appropriate for a global economy. Okay, so laying strong foundations, access, equity, and excellence, creating a national system of education, always an emphasis on not bringing the levels down, not lowering the floor, but raising the ceiling, if you like. Meritocracy, social cohesion, critical and creative thinking are words that are almost emblematic of the way we talk about education policy. And so this is a chart that shows that from 1959 to 1978, 1959 because when we had a sort of local government, decolonizing process, but 1965 when we became individually independent, right? And we have these four phases: survival, how do we build a post-colonial education system? How do we ensure that the vast majority of students are able to complete their education? We reduce attrition. What did we do? And then we moved on, if you like, ability-driven. Moving, if you like, from a state-centered education system in the first two levels, if you like, something that is more individual, student-centric. It's been a completely successful shift or complete shift? No, but I think it's worth thinking about. Key features of the Singapore curriculum: a state-mandated curriculum for all public schools. The pedagogy can be varied, but what should be taught has been determined by the ministry. English is the medium of instruction, but a second language is compulsory, and that will be the sort of mother tongue languages of the different ethnic groups. For the Chinese, Mandarin Chinese; for the Malays, Malay; for the Indians, it would be Tamil. Key national exams at grades 6, 10, and 12. These are very important and key features of the way Singapore has organized its education system. Languages, science, mathematics are central to the curriculum. And as I said earlier, a shift from content mastery to critical and creative thinking, and from extracurricular activities. I think the last one is important because they tend to be in the past an emphasis on the content of the curriculum. The learning takes place, the growth takes place within the classroom, and an effort now to say, no, that is important, but we need to broaden the schooling experience beyond the academic. Thinking Schools, Learning Nation, this is a landmark change in the curriculum, effectively saying, in the future post-industrial economy, what sort of learners, what sort of learning adults would we need? And the emphasis one, as I said earlier, learning how to learn, applied learning, learning that would be meaningful, to some extent even student-centered, in the sense that students should be independent learners, not always waiting for the teacher to teach the textbook in the classroom. Teach Less, Learn More is a continuation of that same philosophy. How do we teach students in a way in which we will empower them? We generally talk about empowering teachers and giving them greater capacities. But I think as children go older in the system, as they go through the system, increasingly at the senior secondary level, the capacity to learn on your own, to indicate what motivates you and excites you most, is going to be important. Okay. We talked about the ability phase, teach less, learn more. This is I can provide some of the details later, but I think we'll need to move on. IT master plan, as I said, we have had 4 master plans. We have the resources, we have the capacity to provide the sort of digital devices, but as I said earlier, I think COVID to some extent showed up that while we had all the infrastructure in place, there was still differentiation between different groups, and there was still a dominance of, if you like, teacher-fronted learning in classrooms rather than the digital learning. But COVID has basically forced a rethink of what the future education system would look like. Competition, meritocracy, and excellence are not mere catchwords in Singapore. It's a continual, unending search for improvement and excellence. And why is exam performance so important? Of course, exam performance is important in all systems. But in Singapore, it is very important because it is seen as being objective, that the education system is held accountable for. You don't get to a good school, as it were, or you don't get to a top-tier school because your family has connections. You go and you are admitted into a tech school because you have demonstrated capacity to be able and deserve to go to that school. So merit is a fundamental aspect of the reason why we emphasize exams. So grade 6, grade 10, grade 12 are very crucial examinations. All right, and it provides for transformation, a transparency in the allocation of educational resources. So assessment reforms, I won't go into detail, but this gives you an example of the step-by-step way in which we have reduced, we have cut back on exams. It used to be that much of the time in preparation for the grade 6 exam, grade 5 and grade 6 was very largely teaching for the exams, right? And the similar thing with grade 10 and the similar thing with grade 12. One of the problems that we've had in Singapore with regard to the system is that we've had an out-of-school tuition industry, which means that students are getting supplemental instruction from teachers or retired teachers or other educators outside of school hours. And the budget and the amount of money that Singapore households pay for this has been estimated recently at 1.7 billion Singapore dollars. That's the consequence of the competitiveness of the system, that parents feel that the child needs not just what is in the school, but what is also out there in the school. And of course, it goes without saying that those who can afford high quality tuition are going to, the children are going to benefit from that. And that creates equity problems. So these are examples. We do reduce content, the expanded use of project work to encourage students to seek, to synthesize and apply knowledge, different types of program, enhance character and values education, and also the ministry introduced an online resource portal to support teachers and students. I did not hear, maybe I missed it, but I did not hear from the other country presentations whether this sort of a resource provided by the ministry or whether curriculum development agency, for example, is available. But it may be something worth thinking about because teachers are going to require lots of assistance as the curriculum, as the pedagogy, as the assessment changes, as we rethink and redesign post-pandemic education systems. So, key curriculum problem: how do you ensure successful implementation of curriculum innovations, especially pedagogic changes? In all systems, teachers cope with the pressures of content, the pressures of what they have to do. Pedagogical practice becomes routinized and it becomes hardened. And it's not easy to change teaching practices. So teacher capacity building, teacher empowerment is going to be very important. The ministry can dictate changes in the curriculum. That is the intended curriculum. But the enacted curriculum is going to fall short. And I think that's something policymakers and teacher educators should be thinking about. Size, degree of centralization, teacher capacity, quality of new instructional materials all matter. Singapore has some unique features. It's a small size, which means that we are able to reach all schools relatively easily. It is centralized, a competitive education system. I talked about high exams, and we have only one teacher education institute. That can be both a blessing and a shortcoming. It can be a blessing because it means that the system is aligned with the ministry's intentions, because the ministry, one ministry of education, no regional ministries, one teacher education system, and one public school system. So the degree of alignment does mean that for us, it is easier, not all easy, but easier for us to move from intent to actualization. Schools are clustered in geographic zones, school clusters. So even though we have about 300 plus schools, they are not all individual schools, right? Singapore is divided into 4 zones, and within each zone, there is a set of clusters, school clusters. And the school clusters are a sharing of the experience so that you can have innovation and change both within schools and between schools, mediated by the clusters. And the cluster is headed by a school superintendent. So it's a strategy that we have, that in a centralized system, we can have a degree of decentralization, but also empower schools to take on this idea that they have a certain amount of autonomy and liberty to do the pedagogic sort of models that are appropriate to the student cohorts that come to their school. So tight, loose, tight, which is a slogan we use, it points to centralized control over curriculum and assessment, but pedagogical flexibility at the school level and clear achievement benchmarks, right? What's the next one? Curriculum, okay, we talked a little bit about this, and it should be, yeah. What did I talk about? Yeah, strong alignment, I talked about. Empowering teachers. Every teacher in Singapore is entitled to 100 hours of PD. Promotion of lesson study, communities of practice. And we have 2 things that which I think are quite interesting: an academy of principals and an academy of Singapore teachers, which are basically intended to provide teachers with some control over the sorts of capacity building that they require and that they wish for. In other words, not everything is dictated as it would be in a centralized system by the Ministry of Education system saying all maths teachers should do this sort of PD, all science teachers should do this sort of PD. It is a way of saying, just as the schools have a degree of curriculum autonomy, teachers must also be able to say, I think we need this sort of training. This school or this cluster of schools needs this sort of teacher training. So this idea of centralization, decentralization is, I think, a dynamic in the Singapore system, which is worth thinking about. And finally, Singapore does not go quickly from a reform implementation plan to doing this. Pilot schools are a way of saying, does this actually work in the school system? What is working, what is not working? And the lessons of the pilot schools then lead to it being centralized and made available to all the schools. Finally, it is a good system. It's a well-resourced system. It's a small system. It's an effective system. But does that mean that it has no problems? Look at this chart. And I ask the question, what equity excellence issues confront Singapore education? Look at the performance levels that they start off in 2006 and move on to 2015. This is the primary 1 cohort. Even in a small system, well-resourced system with high-quality teachers, you see differential outcomes. Now, of course, we don't expect that everything will be a singular line, right? But because Singapore is multi-ethnic, because there are different ethnic groups, the performance of different ethnic groups has consequences for Singapore, because we cannot afford to have any particular ethnic group also or falling down significantly, falling behind significantly in terms of academic achievement. And I can take questions later about what Singapore might be doing this. I just wanted to signal that even in well-run, well-resourced, well-managed systems, you need to be looking at outcomes because they are not likely to be singular. They're likely to be differentiated. And education systems owe a responsibility to make sure that every child of every ethnic group in every region has an equal chance of doing well. So yes, the trend is upward, but the differentiation continues to exist. So post-COVID education problems and opportunities, I think we need to be asking ourselves, what are the problems that have been posed by COVID? But also, look at this one. How do we meet the challenges of inequality? Degrees of inequality will differ according to the different countries in the region. But even in the smallest of countries, inequality is a real issue. Social cohesion is a real issue. Changing nature of work is a real issue. The artificial intelligence phenomenon is going to impact on jobs. And the jobs will not be just the manual jobs in the sort of simple industrial model that we had. That will go because automation will take its place. But even in high-end jobs, artificial intelligence is going to have an impact. If that is going to be the changing nature of work, if we fast forward, let's say, to 2 decades ahead, what sort of a preparation do we need to give? Do we need everybody to learn coding? I don't know. But is it something that we ought to be thinking about if we say that is going to be an increase of technology and there's going to be new technologies that we are not familiar with now? Who would have said that 10, 15 years ago, every one of us would have a handphone? So what new technologies might be available? So in conclusion, we would generally give, both in Singapore and I think globally, Singapore's education system has seen as being a very significant enabler of Singapore's transition from the third world to the first world. In the key roles of nation building, social cohesion, citizenship, skills enhancement, curriculum has made a major role. It has continued to be relevant. But curriculum development, implementation, review, revision are seen as key elements in ensuring curriculum relevance. As I said earlier when I started, this is the Singapore story. It's not the only story that is valuable. It's not a story that's completely successful, but I think that we all can learn lessons from each other, which is why I think a capacity building program of this kind is useful and valuable. Thank you for your attention. I hope it's been of interest to you. Thank you.